John, thank you for coming today. John Broome is the Managing Director of Proclaim, who is the Claims Manager for Fenton Green's CPA Professional Indemnity Facility in Australia. John, we're talking about employment practices liability today. This is obviously a very topical subject with a number of high-profile public cases. The most significant of these recently has been the David Jones matter. At Fenton Green, what we've done this year is we have looked to extend the professional indemnity policy to cover employment practice related exposures. This is a move away from the more traditional professional indemnity policy, which covers effectively the practitioner's liability incurred as a result of an action brought by a third party. This is what we describe as a first party loss, as in a liability associated with running your practice as a result of an employee or effectively a potential employee taking an action against the firm. If we were to break the cover down under the policy, we could break it down in effectively 4 areas of cover. Firstly, termination, that is when we terminate an employee if the employee on the other side has a grievance. Being unfair in relation to the treatment of the employee whilst they are employed by the firm. Harassment of the employee, again whilst being engaged by the firm. And the last one is discrimination. The policy always, as you'll be aware, has exclusions, but in relation to employment practices liability, these are minimal. John, being experienced in these claim matters, I wonder if you could just explain to the practitioners about examples of cover in relation to the 4 areas I've just mentioned.
In relation to termination, the first area, they're probably the most common actions we see. And termination can relate to both actual termination, be it unfair or unwarranted, or it can relate to constructive dismissal, where someone said they're left with no choice but to walk and then bring in action saying that the actions of the company or employer in trying to manage out someone amounted to constructive termination. The main dispute in termination areas revolve around, well, firstly was the termination fair? But secondly, there's also, were the terms that were extended upon termination fair? And that's usually where we see most of the litigation. It's around the actual notice periods that people are provided. And unfortunately, the courts don't really provide fantastic guidance on what's a fair period of notice, which gives rise to a lot of these disputes. I mean, a handy rule of thumb is 2 weeks per year of service, but we've seen many cases where you can either get more or less period of notice depending on the circumstances of the individual, how easy it is to employ them somewhere else, all those kinds of factors are taken into account. One recent case involved actually the retrenchment of an accountant from Woolworths. They'd had 8 years service at Woolworths. The courts decided that in that case, 4 months was a reasonable period of notice. Now, the policy is not intended to provide your entitlements to a notice period. So if the court says you are entitled to 4 months period of notice, the policy won't cover that because you should have paid that anyway. But what it would cover is the legal expenses that arise when you're disputing the period of notice. And that can be quite substantial. And it can have impacts. A lot of these cases are around the impacts, if you've got a large workforce, around fairness for all the other employees as well. The second area that we talked about is unfairness. And unfairness can relate to all kinds of things, natural justice, you can have negligent evaluations, but probably unfairness comes up most in cases which also involve discrimination, which is one of the areas we did touch on. And invariably, the most common cases we see involve women who are either pregnant or returning from maternity leave, where they are not given their original conditions and job description that they had prior to either their pregnancy being announced or their return from maternity leave. And this can lead to, again, significant cases with repercussions both in terms of time, human resources and cost for employers. We probably don't need to labour harassment too much, because I think David Jones has provided everyone in the world with a pretty good window into what happens when there is sexual harassment in the workforce. There's actually a more interesting case, and not quite as public but more interesting recently, in where an employee was awarded $500,000. She was actually terminated following a harassment complaint. So she complained to her employer that she was being sexually harassed. Their response was not to treat the complaint seriously and to start a performance management program, and she eventually was managed out after 3 warnings. The court found that the mental illness that she sustained was a direct result of the treatment of her by the company, and her award was $500,000, and she wasn't a high-paid employee. So you can see that these areas can create huge costs awards, which obviously this policy is intended to provide protection for the employers against large financial exposures like that. The final area that we commonly see claims is in the discrimination area, which I touched on earlier. The problem with these claims is that there can be a reverse onus, and there was a case recently where basically a company, it's called the Blades case, had a retrenchment program where most of the individuals who were retrenched were actually young employees, and one of the younger employees actually brought an action saying that he had been discriminated against on the basis of his age. It's kind of the reverse of what you usually see with older people saying they're being discriminated against. And in this case, the reverse onus applied, so the company had to actually show that it had not discriminated against this worker on the basis of his age. When the court investigated the actual retrenchment program, most of the people who were retrenched were younger workers, and as a result, the court upheld the unfair discrimination claim against the company, so that the individual was awarded, in the end, I think $25,000 as compensation, plus the company incurred a small fine for discriminating against the individual. And that probably doesn't tell the full tale of the cost and the actual time that is taken up in these cases. But there's some examples of the kinds of claims that we tend to see.
Thanks for that. We can see by John's explanation that there is certainly a significant exposure for all employees in the current marketplace, and especially with the new introduction of Fair Work Australia.